Garrett Kane slammed his hand on the briefing table and pointed straight at her. "Get her out of my convoy. I don't babysit comms girls on live ops." Every head in the room turned. Kira Ashford didn't flinch. She just looked at the map. 10 enemy shooters were already moving into position on those ridgelines, and nobody in that room knew it yet. Nobody except her. And before this day was over, every single one of those men would remember her name. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Kira Ashford arrived at FOB Liberty, she carried 2 bags, one standard issue rucksack and one smaller canvas bag she never let out of her sight. Nobody paid much attention. A communications specialist transferring in from Bagram wasn't exactly headline news. The base had real problems to deal with. Hot problems. The kind that came with muzzle flash and body bags. She signed in at the admin desk, got her bunk assignment, and walked across the gravel courtyard with her head down and her eyes up. That was something her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand why. Head down, eyes up. You see everything. Nobody sees you looking. Sergeant First Class Dana Polk. The base's senior comms NCO met her at the equipment bay. Dana was 42, sharp-tongued, and had zero patience for people who showed up needing their hand held. She looked Kira up and down the way a mechanic inspects an engine part she didn't order. "Ashford, you got experience with Harris 152s. "Yes, Sergeant, and the Falcon 3, plus SATCOM configuration if you need it." Dana raised an eyebrow, not impressed exactly, more like she filed it away. "Your record says you are good. We'll see. Don't get in anybody's way, and don't make me look bad." "Understood." That was the whole conversation. Kira was assigned to a corner workstation in the comm shack, given a stack of frequency logs to review and left alone, which was exactly what she wanted. She spent the first hour doing what she was told. She reviewed the logs. She cross-referenced frequencies. She updated the contact sheets. And while her hands were doing all of that, her eyes were doing something else entirely. Through the narrow window of the comm shack, she could see the northern ridgeline. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything most people would look twice at. Just rock and scrub and distance. But Kira had been looking at ridgelines her whole life, and something about that one sat wrong. The angles were too good. The elevation was too clean. If she were going to set up a hide site within 3 kilometers of this base and have a clear line of sight to the main convoy route, that's exactly where she'd go. She wrote nothing down. She said nothing to anyone. She just looked, and she remembered. By noon, she had already mentally mapped 4 elevated positions that would need to be swept before any vehicle movement en route blew. She knew the standard deviation of wind patterns at altitude based on the dust behavior she'd been watching since 0630. She knew that the scrub brush on the eastern slope was moving in a way that didn't match the wind direction, which meant either animals or people. And she knew that the intelligence summary pinned to the briefing board was 3 days old. None of this was her job. She went back to the frequency logs. Master Chief Donovan Brennan saw her in the mess hall that evening. He almost didn't notice her at all, which was itself the thing that made him notice her. He'd been doing this long enough to know that the people who moved through a room without touching anything, without drawing eyes, without creating friction, were usually either completely harmless or the most dangerous people in the space. There was very little middle ground in his experience. He took his tray to a table with a sight line and watched her for about 90 seconds. She ate efficiently. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't talk to the people around her. But she wasn't awkward about it. She wasn't shy. She was simply still, the way a person is still when they've practiced it. He'd known one other person who moved and sat exactly like that, Marcus Ashford. Duke set down his fork. He'd served with Marcus for 8 months in 2009 and again briefly in 2011 before a Taliban sniper with a PKM changed everything. Marcus Ashford had been one of the best natural marksmen Duke had ever seen, and Duke had seen plenty. The man didn't just shoot. He thought in trajectories. He breathed like a metronome. He saw the world in terms of angles and distances and wind. Duke looked at the young woman across the mess hall. She had Marcus's jaw, Marcus's stillness, and that canvas bag she'd set carefully under her chair. While she ate, Duke had a pretty good idea what was in it, and the thought made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't approach her. Not yet. The mission briefing the next morning was held in the main ops room at 700. It was standard setup long table satellite imagery taped to a whiteboard, a dozen people who all believed they were the most important person in the room. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Mitchell ran the briefing. He was 38 West Point, 2 combat tours, the kind of officer who had earned his authority the hard way. He didn't play games and he didn't waste words. Convoy departs 0530 tomorrow. Route blue to the forward relay at grid Mike 7. We're replacing the antenna array and restoring the comm link that went dark 72 hours ago. We have 4 vehicles, 2 gun trucks, 1 equipment, Humvee, and 1 command vehicle. SEALs provide security. Specialist Ashford provides comm support. Garrett Kane, seated to Mitchell's left, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He was 34, built like a piece of industrial equipment, and had exactly the kind of confidence that comes from being right often enough that you forget the times you were wrong. "Who's the comms girl?" he said, not quiet about it. "Specialist Ashford." Mitchell didn't look up from the map. "She'd been outside the wire before." "She has a file, Kane, read it." "I don't need to read it. I need to know if she can move under fire and make decisions in the field, not if she got good marks at Bragg." Kira was seated at the far end of the table. She had a legal pad in front of her. She was not taking notes about communications frequencies. She was sketching the terrain layout from the satellite imagery, noting the 3 ridgeline positions she'd already identified from the window of the comm shack, plus 2 new ones visible in the imagery that she hadn't had the angle to see before. She was marking fields of fire. She was calculating distances. She did not look up when Kane said any of this, which was exactly the right call, and Kane noticed it, and it annoyed him more than if she'd said something back. "She can do her job," Mitchell said, "which is comms. That's all this mission needs from her." 3 weeks of quiet on that route," said Ethan Burke, the team's sniper, from his seat near the door. He said it softly, like he was thinking out loud, but the room heard it. "I don't love 3 weeks of quiet." Mitchell nodded. "Intel says the area is clear." "Intel said a lot of things about that valley in 2012, Burke said. Still soft, still quiet. Duke Brennan hadn't said anything since the briefing started. He was watching Kira. He watched her hand move across the legal pad. He watched her eyes go from the satellite image to the page and back. He watched her tap the end of her pen against the spot on the image that represented the highest ridgeline on the northern approach. He knew exactly what she was doing. He'd watched Marcus do the same thing in a dozen different planning sessions in a dozen different countries with a dozen different maps. She wasn't thinking about frequencies. She wasn't thinking about antenna arrays. She was planning for a fight. After Mitchell dismissed the room, most people filtered out quickly. Kane stopped beside Kira's chair on his way past. He looked down at her legal pad. She turned it over before he could read it. "You sketch," he said. "Sometimes." "You nervous about tomorrow?" "No." He studied her for a second. "You should be." Then he walked out. Duke waited until the room was almost empty, then pulled up a chair and sat across from her. She looked at him directly, which surprised him. Most people who got the Master Chief treatment took a second to find their footing. "You're Marcus Ashford's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes. I served with him, twice." "I know who you are, Master Chief Brennan." She paused. "He mentioned you." That landed harder than she probably intended it to. Duke took a breath. "Good things, I hope." "He said you were the most patient man he'd ever watched work, that you could wait out anything." Duke nodded slowly. "Your father was the same way. Different approach, same patience." He looked at the overturned legal pad. "You were mapping the ridgelines." She didn't deny it. She also didn't confirm it. She just looked at him with those quiet, careful eyes. "You got his eyes too," Duke said. "The way you see a space. He used to walk into a room and within 30 seconds, he'd identified every angle, every shadow, every problem. I'd watch him do it, thought it was the most extraordinary thing." He leaned forward slightly. "What's in the canvas bag, Specialist?" A long pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. "Personal effects," she said. "Uh-huh." He stood up. He didn't push it. "Get some sleep tonight." He walked out. She sat alone in the empty briefing room for another few minutes, the overturned legal pad in front of her, her hand resting flat on the table. Then she flipped it back over, studied her own sketch. Her eyes moved to the highest ridgeline position she'd marked. Then she closed the pad, tucked it under her arm, and left. Back at her bunk, she sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the canvas bag. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside and exactly how it was packed. She'd repacked it herself 4 months ago when her unit got their deployment orders, standing in her apartment in Fayetteville at midnight, telling herself it was just being prepared, just being responsible, that carrying it didn't mean she was going to use it, that a promise was a promise. Her mother had been sitting at the kitchen table when Marcus Ashford's body came home. Kira had been 17. She'd stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her mother age 10 years in the space of an afternoon. And later, much later, when the visitors were gone and the casseroles were stacked in the refrigerator and the house was finally quiet, her mother had looked at her across that same kitchen table and said very plainly, without drama, without anger, just with the exhaustion of a woman who had given everything, "Promise me you'll never pick up a rifle." Kira had promised. She was 24 years old and she had kept that promise for 7 years. Through basic, through AIT, through communication school, and 2 deployments, in every moment where the weight of her father's training pressed against the inside of her chest like something alive. She looked at the canvas bag. She lay down without opening it and stared at the ceiling. The convoy briefing the next morning, the actual final walkthrough, happened at 04:30 in the gray pre-dawn. Kane ran through the vehicle order and load plan. Burke checked his gear twice without being asked. The gun truck crews ran their pre-op with efficiency. Kira stood near the equipment Humvee with her radio rig and her canvas bag and tried to stay in the background. Mitchell passed her on his way to the command vehicle. He stopped. "You good specialist?" "Yes, sir." "Long day, but straightforward." He paused. "You were paying close attention in the briefing yesterday to the imagery." "I was reviewing the terrain for antenna placement options, sir." He looked at her for a moment, a long moment, like he was deciding whether to push it or let it go. "Right," he said finally. "Good thinking." And he kept walking. Kane's voice came from 30 feet away. "Load up. We're burning moonlight." The vehicles pulled out at 05:32. 2 minutes late. Kane's jaw was tight the entire time, and every man on the team felt it. He didn't like running behind. He didn't like surprises. And he didn't like having a comms specialist in his convoy who'd made him feel in a briefing room like he was missing something. Route Blue ran northeast from FOB Liberty through a narrow valley before opening into a wider basin where the relay position sat at the edge of a rocky shelf. Kira had the terrain memorized. She knew every curve of the route before they drove it. She knew where the road dipped and where it climbed and where the rock walls pressed in close on either side, creating natural choke points that any halfway competent ambush commander would look at as gifts. She rode in the equipment, Humvee sandwiched between 2 crates of antenna components, her radio rig active and her canvas bag wedged behind her right knee where she could feel it against her leg. She monitored the frequency. She reported check-ins at each designated waypoint. She did her job, and every 3 to 4 minutes she looked through the small side window at the ridgelines. At the 40-minute mark, they were approaching the narrowest point of the route. The valley pressed in. The rock walls rose to 60-70 feet on both sides. The road surface was bad here, washed out from winter rains, and the vehicles slowed to navigate it. Kira keyed her radio. "Lead comms, checkpoint, 4-time check, 0613. "Copy comms," came Mitchell's voice from the command vehicle. She leaned slightly toward the window. The northern ridgeline was visible now, rising above the right side canyon wall. She looked at the brush line at the top. The wind was coming from the southwest at maybe 6 knots. The brush on the northern ridgeline should have been moving to the northeast. It wasn't moving at all. She stared at it for 4 full seconds. "Lead comms." Her voice was even. "Request immediate halt." A beat. Then Mitchell, "Comms say again." "Request immediate halt, sir. Something's wrong with the ridgeline." In the command vehicle, she could hear the silence. She could hear Kane's voice in the background, sharp and dismissive. "Is she serious right now?" "Specialist Ashford, what exactly are you?" The first shot hit the lead gun truck's front right tire, and the world came apart. The convoy lurched. The second shot came before anyone had finished processing the first, and it punched through the hood of the command vehicle with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Kira was already pressing herself low in the equipment, Humvee one hand on the radio, one hand reaching back for the canvas bag, when the third shot hit the door frame 18 inches from her head. On the radio chaos, Kane's voice cutting through everything tight and controlled in the way that only comes from years of training, overriding every natural human impulse. Contact right, elevation, multiple shooters. All elements, take cover. Take cover now. Burke's voice somewhere outside. I've got 2 on the North Ridge, I'm on it. Then a grunt. Then nothing from Burke. Mitchell. Burke's down. Where's Burke? Somebody get eyes on Burke. Kira pulled the canvas bag against her chest. 7 years of a kept promise pressed against her from the inside like a fist. The rifle inside that bag had belonged to her father. It was zeroed for his eye and his hand and his particular way of seeing the world. And somewhere on that ridgeline there were 10 men with guns, and Ethan Burke was down, and there was nobody left who could do what needed to be done. She unzipped the bag. She hadn't held the rifle in 7 years. The moment her hands closed around it, muscle memory fired like a circuit completing, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not comfort, not excitement, something quieter than both. Something that felt, despite everything, like recognition. I'm sorry, Mom, she said to no one. She pushed open the Humvee door and moved into the fight. The door hit the ground before anyone saw her move. Kira came out of that Humvee low and fast, the M110 pressed against her shoulder like it had never left. Her boots hit the gravel, and she was already moving, already reading the ridgeline, already calculating. 7 years without touching a rifle, and her body remembered every single thing her mind had tried to forget. The convoy was pinned. The lead gun truck had its front end buried against the canyon wall after the tire blew, and the crew was crouched behind the engine block, taking fire from above. The command vehicle was stopped 30 yards back, its hood punched through Mitchell and 2 others flat against the ground on the passenger side. The equipment Humvee she just abandoned was taking sporadic hits rounds, sparking off the roof rack where the antenna cases were strapped. And Ethan Burke was down somewhere, she couldn't see him yet. She moved to the base of the right canyon wall and pressed her back against the rock. Her breathing was controlled. 4 counts in hold, 4 counts out. Her father's voice in her memory patient and certain. Your breath is the only thing you control in a firefight, Kira. Everything else is chaos. You are not chaos. She was not chaos. She came around the edge of the rock and put her eye to the scope. The first shooter came into focus immediately. North Ridge, approximately 400 meters prone position behind a natural rock shelf. He was working the gun truck crew with disciplined, methodical fire. He wasn't panicking. He was good. That actually made it easier because good shooters settle into a rhythm, and a rhythm is predictable. She watched him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she exhaled and squeezed. The rifle cracked once and the first shooter stopped moving. Nobody on the convoy heard it above the noise of incoming fire. Nobody saw her. She was already shifting her point of aim to the second position before the first man had finished falling. On the radio, which was still clipped to her chest rig, Mitchell's voice cut through. Somebody tell me where Burke is. Somebody get eyes on my sniper. Kane. He's behind the rear gun truck. He's hit. Left shoulder, he's conscious. He can't shoot. Mitchell. Then we have no overwatch. Kane, I need options. I'm working on it, Commander. Kira lined up the second shooter. This one was moving, which she respected. He'd seen his partner go down, and he was smart enough to know that something had changed. He was scrambling to a new position about 30 meters east along the ridgeline. She tracked him, stayed with him, waited for him to stop because everyone stops just for a half second when they think they've found new cover. He stopped. She fired. 2. She was already moving before the echo rolled back off the canyon walls. She repositioned 12 feet south back behind a new piece of rock and went still again. Movement is life in a sniper fight, but so is patience, and the balance between them is everything. Her father had said that so many times she used to roll her eyes at it. She was not rolling her eyes now. Kane's voice. What was that? Did we just get return fire from our own position? Somebody check the equipment. Humvee. Vehicle's empty, someone called back. Then where did those shots come from? On the North Ridge, the remaining shooters had noticed. She could see the change in their behavior even through the scope. 2 of them had shifted their orientation, no longer focused entirely on the convoy below, now scanning for a secondary threat. That was good. Confused shooters make mistakes. Mistakes gave her angles. She picked the one who was scanning most aggressively because aggressive scanning means you're already nervous. And nervous means your head comes up too high. His head came up. She fired. 3. Mitchell's voice came through sharp and urgent. Someone is shooting from the canyon floor. Who is shooting sound off all elements? Silence on the radio for a beat. Then Duke Brennan's voice, quiet and steady, in a way that cut right through the noise. Commander, I think I know who it is. Another beat. Mitchell, say again. Give her time, sir. Ita. A pause that felt longer than it was. Then Mitchell, in a voice that had recalibrated itself around something he didn't fully understand yet. All elements hold position. Do not fire on the canyon floor. I say again, do not fire on the canyon floor. Kane's voice, disbelieving and furious in equal measure. You want to tell me what is happening right now? Duke, what's happening is that somebody's doing the job. Kira didn't hear any of this. She'd pulled the earpiece out when she exited the vehicle because she needed silence in her right ear. Silence was information. Silence told her things radio chatter would have buried. The way sound moved off the rock faces at different angles. The change in an enemy shooter's position based on where the next muzzle flash came from. The particular silence after a shot that told you whether your target was truly down or had gone to ground. She was working the ridgeline systematically left to right the same way her father had taught her to read a line of text. You don't skip around. You don't chase the loudest thing. You move methodically because methodical keeps you alive. The fourth shooter was the most dangerous one she'd encountered so far. He'd completely stopped firing once his two nearest partners went down, which meant he was thinking, not reacting. Thinking shooters go quiet and go patient and wait for you to make a mistake. She'd been watching the position she estimated he'd moved to for 90 seconds without a target. On the convoy below, the fire from the remaining 6 shooters was still intense enough to keep everyone pinned. She could hear the incoming rounds, the crack and thump of supersonic bullets, the secondary sounds of impact on metal and rock. Someone down there was calling for a medical kit. She didn't look. She could not afford to look. She waited for the fourth shooter. He lasted 2 minutes and 11 seconds before he made his move. He shifted position to get a better angle on the command vehicle, and the movement crossed her sight picture for just under a second. She was already tracking. She fired. 4. Then she was on her feet and moving again, covering ground in a low scrambling run, repositioning 40 feet north to a new angle on the ridgeline. Her lungs burned. The altitude took something out of every physical movement out here, and she'd been holding tension in her entire body for the last 8 minutes in a way that was burning through her reserves. She pressed against the rock and controlled her breathing and put the scope back up. 6 left. The radio clipped to her chest crackled. Mitchell, whoever is working that ridgeline, I am counting 4 enemy positions that have gone silent. 4. In 8 minutes, someone please confirm what I think is happening. A pause, then a voice she almost didn't recognize because she'd never heard it sound uncertain before. Kane, Commander, the equipment Humvee is empty. Ashford is not in the vehicle. Silence on the net that had actual weight to it. Then Duke, still calm, the calmest voice on that entire frequency. Marcus Ashford's daughter is working the ridgeline, Commander. I'd recommend we let her work. Kira heard none of it. She was already on the 5th shooter. This one had done something smart. He'd repositioned to a spot that gave him deep shadow cover in a narrow firing lane, which meant she couldn't get a clean look at his body, only at the barrel of his weapon when it extended to fire. She watched the barrel. She timed the intervals between his shots. Every shooter develops a rhythm under pressure, even experienced ones. And this man's rhythm was 9 to 11 seconds between shots, with a slight adjustment in the barrel angle before each trigger pull as he tracked moving targets below. She let him fire twice. She timed both intervals. She put her crosshairs 18 inches behind the barrel at the angle the shadow suggested his body was positioned. She waited for 9 seconds. She fired at 8. 5. She was up and moving before the echo cleared. Her right knee hit the gravel hard as she repositioned, and she felt the impact all the way up into her hip, but she didn't slow down. Pain was information. Acute pain that compromised movement was a problem. This was just pain. She found her next piece of cover and went still. Below, something had shifted. The incoming fire from the ridge had dropped significantly in volume. 5 positions eliminated meant the pressure on the convoy had nearly halved, and the remaining shooters were clearly aware that something was deeply wrong. She could see it in how they were moving. They were pulling back from forward positions looking for harder cover, no longer conducting an aggressive, suppressing ambush, but starting to think about what was coming for them. Running through that math made her more dangerous, not less. She found the sixth shooter in a new position about 60 meters east of where he'd been when the ambush opened. He was talking to someone she couldn't see, gesturing back toward the rear of the ridgeline, probably calling for withdrawal. She didn't give him the chance. 6. The man he'd been gesturing to broke and ran. She tracked him for 3 seconds, calculated his speed and direction, put the crosshairs where he was going to be. 7. 12 minutes and 40 seconds since the first shot. 7 down, 3 left. The convoy was still pinned, but the incoming fire had dropped to sporadic and inaccurate. The remaining shooters scared and uncertain and no longer coordinated. She could hear the change in tone on the radio, even with the earpiece out. Less chaos, more control coming back into people's voices. She moved again. This time she went up. There was a natural shelf in the canyon wall about 15 feet off the ground, accessible by a series of broken rock ledges that weren't quite steps, but weren't quite impossible either. She climbed it the way her father had taught her to climb anything in the field. 3 points of contact weight, centered rifle across the back of her forearms, eyes up. Her arms ached. Her knee was going to be ugly tomorrow. She made the shelf in 40 seconds and went prone. From this elevation, she had a completely different sight picture of the ridgeline. She could see things the ground angle had hidden from her, including all 3 remaining shooters, 2 of them now moving together in a low scramble toward a reverse slope that would put them out of her field of fire in about 60 seconds. She didn't have 60 seconds. She shifted right and took the farther one first because the farther one was closer to safety. 8 shifted left. The second moving shooter had heard the shot and dropped flat. She found him in the scope, prone face down, trying to make himself as small as possible. She waited. He lifted his head to look toward the impact site of the previous shot, the way people do when they can't help themselves. 9. 1 left, and this one she couldn't find. She swept the scope methodically across the last known area, checking every shadow, every piece of cover, every angle. Nothing. For 45 seconds, nothing. Her breathing stayed controlled. 4 in, hold, 4 out. She was her father's daughter. She could wait. 60 seconds. Then below her on the canyon floor, she heard Kane's voice, raw and cut through with something she'd never heard from him before. Not from a safe radio distance. From 20 feet away and loud enough to carry up the rock face. There's still one up there. Somebody tell me where the last one is. She saw him in the same moment she heard Kane's voice. The 10th shooter had worked his way along the reverse slope and found a position that gave him a downward angle into the convoy vehicles from the west side of the ridgeline. He wasn't targeting the cover positions. He was targeting the command vehicle. He was targeting Mitchell. She had a narrow partial window. His head and right shoulder through a gap in the rock at 430 meters, with the wind that had picked back up now coming at 11 knots from the southwest and requiring a correction that she had to calculate in her head in the span of about 2 seconds. Her father's voice, calm and clear as a bell in her memory. The wind isn't your enemy, Kira. It's just math. Everything is math if you look at it right. She looked at it right. She fired. 10. The ridgeline went silent. Not the partial silence of an ambush losing momentum. Complete silence. The kind that has a quality to it, a density that you can feel before you understand it cognitively. The kind that means it's over. Kira lay on the rock shelf with her cheek against the stock of her father's rifle and breathed. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. The scope was still up, but her eyes had gone slightly unfocused in that way they do when the adrenaline starts releasing its grip and your body begins presenting you with a full accounting of everything it just did. 18 minutes and some seconds, 10 positions. She hadn't missed once. She didn't feel good about it. She didn't feel bad about it. She felt the way she always felt in the hollow space right after something enormous, which was mostly just very, very tired. On the canyon floor below, the radio traffic had changed completely. Mitchell's voice steady, but with something new underneath it. All clear on the North Ridge. Somebody confirm, is that ridge clear? A pause, then Duke Brennan, Commander? I believe that ridge is clear. How do you know? Because I'm counting, Duke said, and she just fired her 10th shot. Another pause, longer this time. Then Kane, and this was the one that she would remember because she heard it clearly, even from the rock shelf even without the earpiece in because he said it loud enough to carry 10 shots, 10 targets. A pause, in 18 minutes. She heard the disbelief in his voice. She heard something else underneath it that she didn't have a name for yet, but that she would recognize later once the adrenaline was fully gone, and she was sitting in the medical tent with her knee being looked at and her father's rifle laid across her thighs. It was the sound of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew. She climbed down from the rock shelf, carefully favoring the right leg, the rifle slung across her back. When her boots hit the canyon floor, she took 3 steps toward the convoy and stopped. Every person who could see her had stopped moving. Mitchell standing beside the command vehicle. Duke 15 feet to his left. 2 of the gun truck crew. A medic who'd been working on Burke. Kane, who'd come around the front of the lead vehicle and was now standing completely still in the middle of the road. They were all looking at her. She looked back at them. Her face was the same face it had been in the briefing room in the mess hall in the comm shack. Quiet, still, eyes steady, nothing to perform. Kane opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw worked for a second like he was running through a list of things to say and crossing each one off. Finally, what came out was, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She held the rifle a little tighter without meaning to. "My father," she said. The name didn't need to be said. She watched it move through the group. Anyway, watched Duke's expression do something complicated in private, watched Mitchell absorb it with the deliberate calm of a man who was saving the full weight of it for later. Somewhere behind her, Ethan Burke called out from where the medic was still working on him, and his voice was strained but functional. "Did she just do what I think she did?" Duke answered him without taking his eyes off Kira. "Yeah, Ethan, she did." Burke was quiet for a second, then, "Somebody tell me her name again." "Ashford," Duke said. "Specialist Kira Ashford." Another beat. Marcus Ashford's kid, his daughter. The silence that followed was different from every other silence that had happened in that canyon in the last 19 minutes. This one wasn't tactical. It wasn't the silence of danger or assessment or calculation. It was something rare in a place like this, in a situation like this, among people like these. It was the silence of genuine awe. Kira stood in the middle of it and felt the weight of the canvas bag against her back, and the weight of 7 years of a kept promise now broken. And she thought about her mother sitting at a kitchen table in Fayetteville with the whole long, exhausted grief of a woman who had loved a sniper and lost him. She thought, "I'm sorry." She thought, "I'd do it again." Both things were true at the same time, and she held them both without needing to resolve them. Mitchell was the first one to move. He walked toward her slowly, the way you approach something you're still processing, and stopped 2 feet away. He looked at her for a long moment, at the rifle, at her face, at the dog tags just visible inside the collar of her uniform. "You need medical attention," he said. "My knee. It's functional." He nodded. "We'll get it looked at." Another pause. "The relay position is still 3 kilometers out. We have a mission to complete." "Yes, sir." "When we get there, I need the comms array online as fast as possible." "Yes, sir." He held her gaze. "And specialist." A breath. "Thank you." She didn't say anything to that. She just nodded once, the way her father used to nod when something had been said that he felt was true and complete and didn't need elaboration. Then she walked toward the equipment Humvee to retrieve her radio rig, and the convoy began to reassemble around her, and the dust of the canyon settled slowly back onto everything, and the ridgeline above them was perfectly, absolutely still. The convoy reached the forward relay position at 0847. Nobody talked much on the last 3 kilometers. That was unusual. These were men who filled silence with noise as a matter of professional habit, dark humor, and clipped radio banter, in the particular kind of loud confidence that functions as armor. The silence in those vehicles was the silence of people reorganizing their understanding of something fundamental, and that kind of internal work doesn't leave much room for conversation. Kira rode in the equipment Humvee again. Same seat, same radio rig active on her chest. The canvas bag was back behind her right knee, the rifle cleaned and repacked with the same methodical care she'd used since she was 12 years old, and her father had first taught her that a weapon you don't maintain is a weapon that will fail you at the worst possible moment. Her knee had been wrapped with a field dressing by the medic before they rolled out tight enough to keep the swelling contained, loose enough that she could still move without losing feeling in her foot. It hurt with a steady, honest persistence that she found almost grounding. Pain you can predict is pain you can manage. Ethan Burke was in the rear gun truck, his left shoulder packed and his arm immobilized across his chest. He'd refused the morphine. She'd heard him refuse it from 30 feet away, loud enough that there was no question he wanted everyone to know he was refusing it. She understood that. You take the morphine and you're out of the fight officially and completely, and some men would rather bleed clean than cross that line. She respected it. The relay position was a concrete platform and equipment shelter, built into the rock shelf at the edge of the basin, exposed on three sides and exactly as tactically uncomfortable as she'd anticipated from the satellite imagery. Mitchell had two SEAL pairs sweep the interior and the surrounding terrain before he'd let anyone unload equipment, which added 22 minutes, but was exactly the right call, and nobody argued it. Kira was out of the Humvee and moving toward the equipment shelter before the sweep was complete, doing her own assessment of the antenna array. The damage was worse than the briefing had suggested. A primary feed line had been physically cut, not just failed, cut cleanly, which meant someone had been here within the last 72 hours, which meant the intelligence summary about this area being clear was not just outdated, but actively wrong. She looked at the cut for a long moment. Then she got to work. Behind her, she heard Mitchell and Kane talking. She wasn't trying to listen. Sound carried differently in open, elevated positions, and she had good ears, and they were only 15 feet away. Mitchell's voice, quiet and controlled, "I need you to walk me through your read on what happened back there." Kane's voice, and this was the thing about Kane that she was beginning to understand, he was the kind of man who would push back on anything, argue anything, challenge anything, right up until the moment when the evidence was so complete and undeniable that he'd recalibrate with the same full force of commitment he'd put into his original position. No half measures either way. She dropped 10 targets in 18 minutes from the canyon floor, with her father's M110, solo no spotter, no radio coordination under active fire. A pause. "I don't have a frame for that." "Try by." "She's Marcus Ashford's kid. I knew Marcus by reputation, not personally, but every sniper in the community knew the name." Another pause longer. "I didn't know he had a daughter. I didn't know she was trained." "Nobody knew," Mitchell said. "That's the point." Kira connected the replacement feed line and tested the signal. Partial carrier. She adjusted the antenna azimuth by 3 degrees east and tested again. Better. She needed one more component from the equipment crate, and she went and got it without making eye contact with anyone. Duke Brennan was sitting on a rock outcropping near the shelter entrance, cleaning his sidearm with the mechanical repetition of a man who cleans weapons the way other people do breathing exercises. He watched her cross the space and come back with the component and go back inside without pausing. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her with an expression that someone who knew him well would have recognized as grief that had found unexpectedly a direction it could flow toward. At 09:23, she brought the relay link online. She reported it to Mitchell with the same flat professional tone she'd used for every radio check during the convoy. "Commander relay position is live. SATCOM handshake confirmed. All frequencies nominal." Mitchell looked at her for a second. "Good work, specialist." "Sir." She started on the secondary antenna configuration. She was 3 minutes into it when she heard footsteps behind her and felt the particular quality of attention that means someone is standing close and working up to something. She said without turning around, "Say what you came to say, Sergeant Kane." A pause. "How'd you know it was me?" "You walk heavier on your left side, old injury." Another pause. Longer. "Right knee, 2019. She heard him shift his weight. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway. Why communications with that skill set? Why were you not in a sniper program?" She kept working. Her hands didn't stop. "I made a promise." "To who?" "My mother." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Kane was not a man who dealt easily with emotional territory. She could hear that in the way the silence sat on him, the slight discomfort of someone who operates better in the physical world than the interior one. But he stayed. He didn't retreat from it. "She didn't want you to be what your father was," he said. Not a question. She watched what it cost him and what losing him cost her. Kira seated the secondary antenna coupling and checked the torque. "She asked me to promise the night they brought him home. I was 17. I promised." And today, she stopped working for exactly 2 seconds. Then she started again. Today I made a different choice. I'll have to figure out how to live with both of them. She heard Kane draw the breath and let it out slow. Then he said something she genuinely did not expect. My father was a cop, 30 years Chicago PD. He wanted me to go into law enforcement. I joined the Navy instead. He didn't speak to me for 8 months. A beat. He came around. It took time, but he came around. Another beat. I'm not saying it's the same thing. It's not, she said. No, but I'm saying the people who love you hard enough to ask you to promise something like that, they usually love you hard enough to understand when life puts you in a place where the promise breaks. He paused. That's all I'm saying. She didn't respond, but her hands slowed for just a moment on the antenna coupling, and then she continued. Kane left without saying anything else. She listened to his footsteps move away and thought about her mother's face at that kitchen table and thought about 10 men on a ridgeline and thought about the way muscle memory doesn't ask your permission before it fires. It just fires. And she wondered what that meant about who she was underneath all the choices she'd made and all the promises she'd kept. At 10:04, Duke Brennan came to find her. He didn't come in quietly. He sat down on an equipment crate 3 feet from where she was working and put his forearms on his knees and waited until she looked up. She looked up. I need to tell you something, he said, about your father. She kept her expression neutral. All right. He talked about you in the field. Duke looked at his hands for a moment. Not constantly. Your father wasn't a man who talked constantly about anything. But there were times, quiet times, when men share things they don't share in any other context, and he'd talk about you, about teaching you to shoot, about how you had a natural stillness he'd never seen in anyone your age. A pause. He used to say you were going to be better than him. He believed that completely. She said nothing. The antenna coupling blurred slightly in her vision, and she blinked it clear. He also used to say the thing he was most afraid of was that you'd have to use it, that gift. He was afraid of the world that would require it. Duke looked up at her. I don't know if that helps anything. I just thought you should know he saw it. All of it. Everything you just did today, he saw it in you before you were old enough to understand it yourself. Her throat was tight. She nodded once the same way her father used to nod, and Duke recognized it, and they sat with that recognition for a moment. Then Kira said, Did he ever tell you about the promise, the one I made to my mother? Duke shook his head. He didn't know about it. He was gone before you made it. She absorbed that. So he never knew I stopped? No. She thought about that. Her father teaching her to shoot in the field behind their house in Georgia summer mornings before school, patient and exacting, and never once treating her like anything other than a student worthy of his complete attention. Her father not knowing that at 17, at a kitchen table with her mother's eyes on her, she'd set all of it down. And then her picking it up again today in a canyon in Afghanistan, and every shot going exactly where she'd intended it to go, as if 7 years hadn't happened at all. He trained me that well, she said quietly. Even the years didn't take it. Duke looked at her steadily. No, they didn't. Then Mitchell's voice came from outside, sharp and immediate. All elements, we have movement on the eastern approach. 2 vehicles unknown. QRF is 40 minutes out. Everyone get your gear and get ready. The moment broke. She was on her feet before Duke was, which told him everything he needed to know. The movement on the eastern approach turned out to be a local shepherd with 2 vehicles worth of extended family cleared and waved off within 12 minutes by a combination of Mitchell's interpreter and Kane's very large physical presence at the perimeter. But those 12 minutes were electric with tension, every person on that position running the math on 40 minutes to QRF in the memory of what the morning had already cost them. When it cleared, the release of tension was almost audible. Burke's voice from across the position. Can someone tell the universe that I have had enough excitement for football for one Tuesday? Low, exhausted laughter from 3 or 4 people. The first real laughter since before the convoy rolled out that morning. The kind that comes out sideways when people have been holding too much for too long. Kira didn't laugh, but she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. At 10:47, Mitchell called her to the command vehicle for a formal debrief. He had a notebook open and a pen in his hand, and the expression of a man who was going to do this correctly because doing it correctly mattered regardless of how unusual the circumstances were. "Walk me through your decision-making from the point of the ambush," he said. She walked him through it, shot by shot, position by position, timeline and rationale for each movement decision. She spoke the way she'd been trained to speak in mission debriefs, precise and sequential. No emotional editorializing, just the facts of what she'd observed and decided and done. Mitchell took notes without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You requested a halt before the first shot came in." "Yes, sir." "You saw it before it happened." "I saw indicators. The brush wasn't moving correctly." There were 4 positions on that ridgeline I'd identified as ideal hide sites from the FOB and from the imagery. The 3-week quiet period on the route concerned me. The indicators together suggested a setup. "Why didn't you report it through the chain of command?" She held his gaze. "I did, sir. I requested the halt on the radio." He looked at his notes. "Before that, in the briefing, you were mapping those ridge lines on your legal pad." "A beat. I was making observational notes, sir." "Specialist." His voice was not unkind. "Why didn't you tell me what you were seeing?" She was quiet for a moment. This was the question that had the honest answer and the comfortable answer, and she'd made enough choices today that the comfortable answer felt like something she couldn't afford anymore. "Because my job was communication, sir. I was a comms specialist." Pointing at a map in a briefing and telling a room full of SEALs that I thought the ridge lines were compromised would have been received in a particular way that probably would have gotten me removed from the mission. A pause. I wasn't wrong about that. Mitchell held her gaze. He knew she was right, and she could see him knowing it. "No," he said quietly. "You weren't wrong." He wrote something in his notebook. "That changes today. You understand that?" "Sir, what you are and what your role is, that changes today." He looked up. "This goes in my report. Everything. Your prior training, your performance this morning, your tactical analysis capability. All of it." He paused. "I suspect a number of people will want to talk to you when we get back." She processed that. "Yes, sir." "Is there anything you want me to include in the report that you haven't told me?" She thought about it. "I missed the 4th shooter's position initially by about 30 meters. I had to wait him out. That cost approximately 90 seconds. She paused. "I could have been faster." Mitchell stared at her. "You dropped 10 targets solo in 18 minutes, and you want me to note that you could have been faster." "Accuracy matters, sir, in debriefs and in the field." He looked at her for a long moment, then he closed his notebook. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I'm certain of that." She looked at him. "Thank you, sir." She walked back out into the dry, thin mountain air, and the first person she saw was Kane. He was standing at the perimeter, watching the eastern approach. He heard her coming and turned, and for a long, strange moment, they just looked at each other. Then Kane said, "Burke wants to talk to you." She walked across the position to where Burke was sitting against the equipment shelter wall, his arm in a proper sling, now his face pale under his tan, but his eyes sharp. He looked at her when she approached with an expression she'd never seen aimed at her before, a kind of frank professional respect that carried no conditions. "Sit down," he said. She sat on a rock a few feet away. He studied her for a second. "I've been a sniper for 11 years, he said. "Qualified instructor. I've trained guys who went on to top-end programs." A pause. "What you did this morning, the sequence, the repositioning the patients on the 4th target, that wasn't trained yesterday's skill. That was deep." "My father started when I was 7, she said. "How old were you when you stopped?" She looked at him. 17. He absorbed that. 7 years off the rifle and you shot like that. Muscle memory doesn't have an expiration date if the foundation is right. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer it straight." "All right. Did you know before the convoy rolled that it was going to go hot?" She held his gaze. "I believed the probability was high. I couldn't confirm it." "But you packed the rifle." A long pause. "I packed the rifle." Burke nodded slowly. "That's the difference between a good shooter and an operator," he said. "A good shooter reacts. An operator prepares for what everyone else hasn't admitted is possible yet." He looked at her steadily. "You were prepared." She didn't answer that. She looked out toward the eastern approach, where the dust of the departed shepherd's vehicles was still settling. When you get back to the FOB, Burke said, there's going to be a conversation. About your file, about your role. He paused. I want you to be ready for it. What kind of conversation? The kind where people who have authority over your career realize that they've been using a precision instrument as a blunt tool. He shifted his arm in the sling and winced slightly. The kind that could change what the rest of your service looks like. She thought about that, about what it meant, about her mother, about a kitchen table in Fayetteville, and a promise made at 17 by a girl who was grieving and certain she was doing the right thing. I don't know what I want the rest of my service to look like, she said honestly. Burke looked at her with the directness of someone who spent enough time close to mortality that they don't have patience for anything less. Yes, you do, he said. You knew it the moment you unzipped that bag. She said nothing. He let the silence sit. Then you're good, Ashford, genuinely good. Your father's daughter in every way that matters. A pause and something shifted in his voice, something quieter and more private. I served one rotation with Marcus 2010. He was already a legend then. I was a junior guy who didn't know enough to know how much I didn't know. He took the time to teach me something anyway. His jaw tightened slightly. I owed him a debt I never got to repay. She looked at him. He never mentioned debts. He wasn't built that way. No, he wasn't. Burke met her eyes. But I am, and today you gave me a way to start settling one I've been carrying for 15 years. A pause. So, thank you. She didn't know what to say to that. She looked away first. 40 meters across the position, Kane was still watching the eastern approach. But his posture had changed. She noticed it the way she noticed everything automatically without effort. His shoulders were different. The set of them. Something had come down that had been up all morning, some long-held resistance that required too much energy to maintain anymore. He turned and caught her looking. He held it for a second, then he nodded, just once. She nodded back. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the ache in her knee and the 7 years of a broken promise pressing against the inside of her chest, something shifted, not resolved, not simple, but shifted like a weight redistributed like a load that hasn't gotten lighter, but has been adjusted to a position you can actually carry. The QRF arrived at 11:12, 4 vehicles, additional medical capability, and a reaction platoon that had driven hard and fast since the convoy's contact report went out. The platoon leader, a young captain named Torres, jumped out of the lead vehicle and went straight to Mitchell with the focused urgency of someone who'd spent the last 40 minutes mentally preparing to manage a catastrophe. Mitchell briefed him in 4 minutes flat. Torres looked around the position, at the wounded, at the intact equipment, at the antenna array now fully operational and transmitting, at the convoy battered but functional. Then his eyes landed on Kira. She's the one, he said to Mitchell. She's the one, Mitchell said. Torres looked at her for a long moment. He was 28, maybe 29, with the earnest intensity of someone who had not yet accumulated enough time in country to have the edges worn smooth. He was clearly running through everything he'd just been briefed against the person standing in front of him, trying to reconcile the numbers with the specialist insignia on her collar. He walked over to her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her, the way people look at something they genuinely weren't sure they believed was real. 10 targets, he said, solo. Yes, sir. In 18 minutes. 17 minutes, 50-something seconds, approximately. He blinked. You were counting. Habit, she said. He shook his head slowly, not dismissive, the opposite. The kind of head shake that means you are watching the world reveal something you didn't know it contained. Your name is going to be in a lot of reports, he said. I've been told. Is there anything you need right now? She thought about it. Satellite uplink confirmation on the secondary antenna. I want to verify it before we load out. Torres stared at her for another second. Then he laughed once, a short, genuine sound, and stepped aside. By all means, specialist. She went back to the antenna. Behind her, she heard Torres say to Mitchell quietly enough that he probably didn't intend her to hear, "Does she know what she just did?" Mitchell's voice equally quiet. She knows exactly what she did. That's what makes her who she is. The secondary antenna confirmed clean signal at 1128. She reported it to Mitchell. He acknowledged it. She began breaking down the work area and preparing the equipment for loadout, moving through the task. with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Hands busy, eyes steady, the canvas bag against her back. Duke came to help her with the antenna casing without being asked. They worked side by side in silence for a few minutes. Comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have already said the important things and don't need to fill the space with lesser words. Then Duke said, not looking at her, "Your father used to say the hardest shot he ever took wasn't the longest or the most technical. It was the first one after the longest dry spell, when you're not sure if you still have it." She looked at him. "He told you that more than once." Duke sealed the antenna case and picked it up. Said the fear before that shot was the only fear he ever felt in the field. A pause. Said once you take it and it goes where it's supposed to go, something settles in you that doesn't unsettle again. She thought about the fourth shooter, the 90 seconds of waiting, the crosswind calculation, the trigger break. She thought about what had settled in her when the 10th shot landed. "Yeah," she said quietly, "something like that." They carried the equipment to the vehicles together. The convoy began to reassemble for the return to FOB Liberty. Mitchell ran through the load plan with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, calm and sequential and thorough. Kane did the vehicle checks. Burke was helped into the rear gun truck and situated with more care than he'd have accepted from anyone else. Kira climbed into the equipment Humvee and sat in her seat and felt the canvas bag press against the back of her knee. The convoy rolled at 11:43. She put her eye to the side window and looked at the ridgelines as they passed back through the valley. All of them still, all of them quiet. She watched them the entire way through. The convoy rolled through the gates of FOB Liberty at 13:19. Kira knew something was different before the vehicle stopped moving. She could feel it in the quality of attention on the other side of those gates. Too many people standing in places they didn't normally stand. Too many faces turned toward the incoming vehicles with expressions that had already been briefed on something. Word travels fast on a forward operating base, faster than vehicles, faster than dust, faster than almost anything except radio traffic. And the radio traffic from that canyon had gone out to multiple stations across 2 different networks. By the time they'd cleared the gate, she understood that the world she was returning to was not the same world she'd left at 5:32 that morning. Mitchell was out of the command vehicle before it fully stopped. He spoke to 2 officers Kira didn't recognize briefly with the efficient communication of someone who has already said everything important on the radio and is now just confirming logistics in person. One of the officers was a full colonel. Kira noticed his rank, filed it, and began unloading equipment from the Humvee. Kane appeared at her elbow. "Leave the gear," he said. "Someone else will handle it." She looked at him. "It's my equipment." "Ashford." He said her name the way people say it when they're trying to redirect someone who is using a task as armor against something they're not ready to face. "Leave it." She left it. He walked with her toward the ops building, and she understood from the way he positioned himself slightly to her left and one step back that he was not escorting her so much as accompanying her. There was a difference. One was authority. The other was something that didn't have a clean military term for it, but that she recognized from the way her father used to describe certain men he'd served with. Men who showed up when it cost them something. The colonel's name was Hargrove. He was 60 career Army with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of difficult decisions into something that looked less like age and more like geology. He had Mitchell's mission report already in his hand, which meant someone had been transmitting updates in real time during the operation, which meant this had been watched more closely than a standard convoy resupply warranted. He looked at her the way the young Captain Torres had looked at her, with that same quality of genuine recalibration, but quieter, more controlled, the expression of someone who has seen more things in more places and therefore requires more evidence before he lets it show. "Specialist Ashford," he said. "Sit down." She sat. Kane stood near the door. Mitchell took a chair to Hargrove's right. "I've read Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's report," Hargrove said. "Twice. I want to hear it from you." She told him, same way she'd told Mitchell at the relay position. Precise, sequential, no editorializing. Shot by shot. Decision by decision. She watched him listen, and she watched him make no notes because he was the kind of man who retained what mattered without writing it down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long since you fired that rifle?" 7 years, sir, prior to this morning. 7 years. He repeated it flatly, not skeptical, processing. And your qualification records show you as a communications specialist with standard small arms quals. Nothing beyond that. Yes, sir. Why, she had given this answer before to Kane to Mitchell. Each time it came out slightly differently, because each time she was talking to a different person, and the truth has different angles depending on who you're showing it to. To Hargrove, she said, I made a personal commitment that I honored for 7 years. This morning, honoring it would have cost lives. Hargrove looked at her for a long time. So you broke it. I made a different choice. I'm still working out what that means. He held her gaze. Your father was one of the finest snipers this army ever produced. I didn't serve with him directly, but I knew his record the way everyone in a certain circle knew it. He paused. I also know he died in this country, in terrain not entirely unlike this morning's. A pause. I imagine your mother's request was not made without very good reason. No, sir, it was not. And you're prepared for what comes next when you contact her. The question landed harder than she expected. She had not let herself think about that call, had been not letting herself think about it since approximately the moment her boots hit the canyon floor with the rifle in her hands. She looked at Hargrove steadily and said, I'll handle it, sir. He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once. All right. He closed the folder in front of him. Here is what happens now. Your service record is being reviewed at my request. Your performance this morning will be fully documented and entered. I am also initiating a formal inquiry into the intelligence failure that resulted in your convoy being compromised, because the 3-week quiet period and the physical evidence of tampering at the relay position indicates an operational security breach that needs to be addressed immediately. He paused. None of that is your problem to solve. Your problem right now is to get medical attention for that knee, get some food in you, and be available for a follow-up debrief at 1700. Yes, sir. Dismissed. She stood. She was halfway to the door when Hargrove said without looking up, Specialist. She stopped. Your father would be proud. He said it without sentiment, like a fact being recorded. That's not a compliment. It's an assessment. She walked out. Kane was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence for 30 seconds. Then he said, How'd that go? Fine. Hargrove's a serious man. If he's pulling your service record, things are moving. I know. You're not going to be a comm specialist much longer. She stopped walking, turned to look at him, and said the things she'd been carrying since the canyon, since the relay position, since Burke's quiet words about precision instruments and blunt tools. I don't know what I want to be. I know what I am. I'm not sure yet that those are the same thing. Kane looked at her with an expression that had none of the dismissiveness she'd seen in the briefing room the day before. None of the aggressive challenge, none of the casual authority of a man who has decided your value before you've demonstrated it. He looked at her the way people look at other people when they're actually seeing them. You're a sniper, he said. That's what you are. The rest is just paperwork. She looked at him for a moment. You said yesterday morning that I should be nervous about the convoy. I remember. You were trying to scare me off. I was trying to establish whether you could handle it. And the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something drier than that, more earned. You can handle it, he said. I think that's fairly well established at this point. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she kept walking. The medical bay was run by a Navy corpsman named Reyes, who had the efficient bedside manner of someone who has seen enough genuine emergencies that minor injuries get treated with focused competence and zero drama. He unwrapped her knee, assessed it with his hands while she stared at the wall, declared it a grade 2 sprain, with some tissue irritation rewrapped it properly, gave her ibuprofen and instructions to stay off it as much as possible for the next 48 hours, and then looked up at her with the expression of someone who has been doing all of this while also processing something unrelated. You're the one, he said, from the canyon. Apparently. He looked at her knee and then at her face. Does it hurt? Yes. Good. He meant it as a measure of function, not punishment, she could tell from his tone. Means the nerves are working right. He handed her the ibuprofen. Take these. Drink water. Don't do anything heroic for the next 2 days. I'll try. He looked at her one more second. Your father's rifle, right? The M110? She looked at him, surprised. Yes. I saw Marcus Ashford shoot once. 2009 Kunar province. I was a junior corpsman attached to a unit that was working the same area. We saw him work a ridgeline from about 800 meters. He shook his head slightly. I never forgot it. The patience of it. The absolute stillness. He paused. Same rifle. Same rifle. He nodded slowly. It showed, he said quietly. I mean that as a serious compliment. She took the ibuprofen and left. The walk back to her bunk took her across the main courtyard, and this was where she understood completely, and finally the full scope of what had changed. Because the courtyard was not empty, and the people in it were not going about normal business. They were there in the way that people are there when they're not quite ready to approach someone, but also cannot make themselves look away. She counted 11 people in her immediate sightline, all of them aware of her, none of them pretending otherwise. She walked straight through the middle of it with her head down and her eyes up the way her father had taught her, and she made it to her bunk without stopping. She sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the canvas bag. She needed to call her mother. She took out her personal phone and looked at the contact. The profile photo was from 2 Christmases ago. Her mother in the kitchen of the Fayetteville house, laughing at something off camera aligned with the particular warmth of a woman who has rebuilt herself after catastrophic loss through sheer force of love and stubbornness. Her mother had done that, had taken the rubble of losing Marcus and built something else from it, a life, a garden. A relationship with her daughter that was real and complete and full of things that were never said because they didn't need to be. Kira held the phone for 6 minutes without dialing. Then she dialed. 3 rings. Her mother's voice warm and immediate. Kira, I was just thinking about you. Hey, Mom. A pause. Her mother had a way of hearing things in silences that most people couldn't hear. She'd had it even before Marcus died and after it had become something almost supernatural. What happened? Kira closed her eyes. We had a contact today, on a convoy. Are you hurt? My knee, it's minor. I'm okay. But something else. Not a question. She opened her eyes and looked at the canvas bag. I had Dad's rifle with me. I've had it with me the whole deployment packed. I never intended to use it. She stopped. Mom, I used it. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Kira counted them. Then her mother said very quietly, How many? She blinked. Of all the things she'd anticipated, all the responses she'd been bracing for, that was not one of them. 10, she said. Another silence, shorter. And everyone on your convoy. Alive, 1 man wounded, he's going to be okay. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word, something that carried the weight of 10,000 things compressed into a single exhale. Then, I want you to listen to me. Mom, no, listen. Her mother's voice was steady, not hard, steady the way a hand is steady when it's holding something fragile with intention. I asked you to make that promise because I was sitting at a kitchen table at 41 years old watching them bring home the man I loved in a box, and you were 17, and I was terrified that what I was looking at was the rest of your life too. I was terrified of what you'd inherited. I was terrified of what it would cost you. A breath. I was wrong to ask you. Kira said nothing. Not wrong to feel it, not wrong to need it in that moment, but wrong to put it on you. You were 17 and grieving, and you would have promised me anything I asked. A pause. I've known that for a long time. I just didn't know how to take it back. Kira's throat had closed entirely. She pressed her free hand against her knee, felt the wrapped joint, felt the pain held it. You saved people today, her mother said. Your father saved people his whole career. That was his gift, and it was also his calling, and I spent years after he died being angry at both of those things because I felt like they took him from me. A breath. But they didn't. He was always going to be who he was, just like you are always going to be who you are. Her voice softened further. You are his daughter, baby. You always were. I was just too scared to let you be. The tears came without warning. Not dramatic, just quiet and sudden, the way tears come when something that has been held too long finally releases. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it. I'm sorry I broke the promise, she said. Don't be. Her mother's voice was absolutely certain. Don't be sorry for 1 second. They talked for 20 more minutes. About nothing and everything. About the garden, about the neighbor's dome, about a book her mother was reading. The ordinary architecture of a relationship between two people who love each other and have learned to live inside the space that grief creates without being consumed by it. Kira sat on her bunk with her wrapped knee extended and her father's rifle packed in its canvas bag against the wall and listened to her mother's voice fill the tiny room. When they hung up, she felt scraped clean in the best possible way. Like something that had been calcified for 7 years had been dissolved, and what was underneath was not raw or wounded but simply new. She lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling for 12 minutes. Then she got up and went to the debrief. The 1700 debrief was a different animal from the morning's mission briefing. The room was smaller and the table had more people around it than she expected. Mitchell, Hargrove, 2 officers she didn't know, Duke, Kane, a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Sarah and who Kira clocked immediately as intelligence, because intelligence people introduce themselves only as Sarah and think that tells you nothing when it actually tells you quite a lot. And Ethan Burke, his arm in a proper sling, sitting very straight in his chair with the careful posture of a man managing pain with discipline. They went through the morning systematically. Every decision, every shot, every movement. The intelligence officer, Sarah, was particularly interested in the cut feed line at the relay position and spent 15 minutes on that alone, asking questions that were very specific in the way that means you already know some of the answers and are triangulating toward the ones you don't. Then Hargrove looked around the table and said, I want to discuss Specialist Ashford's role going forward. She went very still. The Army has a sniper program, Hargrove said. It has a specialized skills pipeline. It also has processes for identifying candidates and bringing them through the appropriate channels. He looked at her directly. Those processes exist for good reasons. They also were not designed with this particular situation in mind. A pause. What I am prepared to do is initiate an expedited review of your qualifications and service record with a recommendation for assessment by the sniper school at Fort Moore. That is not a guarantee of anything. It is a door. She looked at him. And my current assignment remains in place pending the outcome of the review. You are still a communications specialist. A pause. A communications specialist who will not be going on any further convoys in this AO without full tactical acknowledgement of her complete capability. He looked at Mitchell. That's non-negotiable. Mitchell nodded. Agreed. Kane said from his seat near the door. Also non-negotiable, she gets a spotter. No more solo work. He said it with the authority of a man stating a professional standard, not making a request. What she did this morning worked because there was no other option. Going forward, there is always another option. She works with a spotter. Burke raised his good hand slightly. When my shoulders cleared, I volunteer. The room was quiet for a moment, then Duke, that might be the first thing today that surprised me. Burke looked at him. I owe a debt. I'm paying it in installments. Sarah, the intelligence officer, looked up from her notes. Specialist Ashford, the cut feed line at the relay position. When you saw it, what was your immediate assessment? Inside access, someone with knowledge of the relay schedule and the frequency configuration. The cut was too clean and too specific for opportunistic sabotage. They knew exactly what to cut and when. Sarah made a note. That's consistent with what we're seeing from other indicators. She didn't elaborate. Intelligence people never elaborate when they can avoid it. But the look she exchanged with Hargrove was brief and specific and carried information Kira wasn't cleared for, but could read the shape of. Something larger was moving. Something that had been set in motion before today and that today had accelerated. Kira filed it and said nothing. The debrief ended at 1843. People filtered out. Duke caught her eye on his way past and gave her a single nod that contained about 11 different things, none of which needed to be said out loud. She nodded back. Kane was the last to leave besides her. He stopped at the door and turned back. He looked at her across the empty table with an expression that had none of yesterday's aggression and none of today's crisis energy. Just a man looking at another person he'd badly misjudged and acknowledging it without performing the acknowledgement. I was wrong about you, he said. I want to say that directly. You didn't know me. Doesn't make being wrong about someone acceptable. He held her gaze. I dismissed you based on your role and your age and the fact that you were quiet. A pause. Those are bad reasons. I know better. She looked at him steadily. We're good, Kane. He studied her for a second like he was deciding whether she meant it or was just managing the social discomfort of the moment. He apparently decided she meant it. All right, he said. He started to leave. Stopped. For what it's worth, the request to halt, before the first shot. You called it right. I heard it on the radio and I was already dismissing it before the words were out. A pause. If Mitchell had acted on it immediately, we might have had more options. Less exposure. Another pause. That's on me too. I was in his ear and I talked over you. She held his gaze. Also noted. Don't let anyone do that again, he said. Whatever room you're in, whatever your role, don't let anyone talk over you again. He looked at her with something that was close to fierceness. You've earned a voice. Use it. He left. She sat alone in the empty briefing room for a few minutes the way she'd sat alone in a different briefing room the morning before with the legal pad full of ridgeline sketches turned face down. The parallel was not lost on her. 24 hours, an entire world of difference. She thought about Burke's words at the relay position, about precision instruments and blunt tools. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone. She thought about her father moving through a field in Kunar province in 2009 while a junior corpsman watched from 800 meters away and never forgot what he saw. She thought about the fourth shooter, the 90 seconds of waiting, the wind calculation, the moment the trigger broke. She thought about what had settled in her after that 10th shot. She pulled out her legal pad. The sketches were still there, the ridgeline positions, the fields of fire, the calculated distances. She looked at them for a moment, then she turned to a fresh page, and she began to write. Not a mission report, not a debrief summary, something personal and private the way her father had kept notebooks that her mother still had in a box in the closet of the Fayetteville house. Not a journal, more like a record, a documentation of what she'd seen and what she'd known and what she'd decided and why. She wrote until the light outside the single window changed from gold to gray. Then she closed the pad, tucked it under her arm, and walked out into the FOB Liberty evening with the canvas bag over her shoulder and her knee aching with an honest, steady persistence, and her father's dog tags warm against her chest. The courtyard was busy with the particular energy of a base at end-of-day personnel, moving between buildings, the smell of food from the mess hall, the distant sound of a generator cycling. Normal. Entirely, stubbornly, persistently normal, the way military life specializes in being normal around the edges of things that are not normal at all. 3 people stopped her on the way to the mess hall. Not officers, junior enlisted. A private who couldn't have been more than 19 who looked at her with open, undisguised awe and then got embarrassed about it and walked away quickly. A staff sergeant who shook her hand without saying anything. A female specialist who stopped and looked at her and said quietly and directly, I heard what you did. I just wanted to say it matters. To people like us, it matters. Kira looked at her. People like us, people who get looked past. She held Kira's gaze. It matters. She walked on. She got her food and she sat alone and she ate efficiently and she looked out the mess hall window at the northern ridgeline in the last of the evening light. Still, quiet, patient. The rifle was in the canvas bag under her chair. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't a surprise. The knee woke her twice in the night with a deep, insistent ache that ibuprofen had taken the edge off but not eliminated. The third time she woke, it wasn't the knee at all. It was silence. The particular quality of 0300 silence on a forward operating base, that total stillness that exists in the gap between the last late patrol and the first early movement when the base breathes in and holds it. She'd been in enough of these places to know that silence by feel, and tonight it pressed against her differently than it used to, like something had changed in the frequency of it, like she was hearing it with different ears than she'd had yesterday morning. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and listened. She thought about the female specialist in the mess hall, people who get looked past. It matters. She'd said it so directly without performance or sentiment, just the plain delivery of a truth she'd been carrying, and had decided in that moment to put down in front of someone who might understand the weight of it. Kira understood it. She'd been looked past her entire time in uniform. She'd cultivated it deliberately, the stillness, the efficiency, the way of occupying a room without pressing against its edges, She told herself it was tactical. Head down, eyes up. You see everything. Nobody sees you looking. But somewhere in the gap between tactical and protective, she'd let it become something else, something smaller. She'd made herself invisible not just to stay safe, but because invisible felt like the only version of herself that nobody could take away. She sat up at 0347, got dressed in the dark, picked up the canvas bag, walked out. The comms shack was empty at this hour except for the overnight duty specialist, a young private named Garza who looked up with the startled alertness of someone fighting sleep and then relaxed when he saw it was her. Specialist Ashford. Garza, anything on the nets? Quiet, ma'am. Colonel Hargrove's got an information hold on the Route Blue incident pending the intel review. Nothing's moving on that publicly yet. Copy. She sat at her workstation, not because there was anything urgent requiring her attention, because the familiar architecture of the equipment, the radios and the frequency logs and the contact sheets was something she knew how to be inside without having to decide anything. She needed an hour of not deciding anything. She had 40 minutes before the deciding started again. At 4:31, Duke Brennan walked in. He saw her immediately registered the canvas bag under her workstation and pulled a chair without asking permission or explaining himself. He sat down and looked at the equipment, the way people look at things when they're actually thinking about something else. Couldn't sleep either, she said. Not a question. I sleep fine, he said. I woke up at 4 and decided I was done. A pause. There's a difference. Is there? At my age, yes. Very much yes. He looked at her. How's the knee functional? That's not what I asked. She glanced at him. It hurts. I'll manage. He nodded, reached into the cargo pocket of his trousers, and produced 2 protein bars, set one on her workstation without comment. She picked it up. They ate in silence for a minute. Then Duke said, Sarah came to find me after the debrief. She looked at him. The intelligence officer. She's not exactly just an intelligence officer. But yes, he folded the wrapper from his protein bar with the neat precision of someone who has spent decades in field conditions where leaving trash is a discipline issue. She's been watching the route degradation for 6 weeks. The 3-week quiet period wasn't randomness. It was deliberate. Someone was creating a pattern of apparent calm specifically to lower the security posture on Route Blue convoys. A pause. The relay station wasn't a target of opportunity, it was bait. Kira went still. The cut feed line was cut to ensure a convoy with resupply equipment would be sent out on a predictable timeline. They knew when we'd go and roughly what we'd bring. He looked at her steadily. They were not expecting you. She absorbed this. The ambush was designed for a standard security element. Correct. 10 shooters against 2 gun trucks in a SEAL team with their sniper already in position, calculated to be overwhelming within the first 3 minutes. Air support 45 minutes out. He paused. It would have worked, against what they expected. She looked at her workstation, the frequency logs, the contact sheets, the completely ordinary surface of a communications specialist's in daily work. They didn't account for me because nobody accounted for me, she said. That's right. The thing Kane dismissed me for. The invisibility. That's what broke their plan. Duke looked at her with an expression that had something ancient in it, something that had lived a long time and seen too much to be surprised, but had not yet lost the capacity to be moved. Marcus used to say the most dangerous weapon in any fight is the one the enemy doesn't know exists. A pause. I don't think he knew he was describing his own daughter. She sat with that for a moment. Let it settle into the places inside her that had been rearranging themselves since yesterday morning. What does Sarah want? She asked. What did she actually come to tell you? Duke was quiet for 3 seconds. She wants to talk to you at 0800. Formally. She's not alone in that conversation. There will be people present who have authority over programs that aren't in any briefing you've attended. He held her gaze. I'm telling you so you're not walking in blind. She felt the weight of it. Not fear, something more complex than fear. The particular gravity of a door opening onto something irreversible, something that once walked through cannot be unwalked. What kind of programs? The kind that need people who can do what you did yesterday. The kind that specifically need people nobody expects. He paused. The kind Marcus was approached about twice and turned down both times because he wouldn't leave your mother and you. The silence that fell after that was the heaviest one of the night. She looked at the canvas bag under her workstation. She thought about her father making a choice, a specific, conscious, costly choice to stay visible and available rather than disappear into something classified and distant. She thought about the cost of that choice, measured against what it bought: years with her mother, years with Kira, summer mornings in a field in Georgia, teaching a 7-year-old to breathe through a trigger pull. She thought about what it had not bought, what it had not protected him from in the end. "He still died," she said quietly. "Yes," Duke said. "He did." No softening of it, no comfort wrapped around it. Just the plain truth of it, which was the only thing she'd have accepted from him anyway. He made his choice with full knowledge of the risk. He just chose differently than they wanted him to. A pause. "The question is what you choose." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me what you think I should do?" "No." "Why not?" "Because Marcus would have hated it if someone did that to you, and because you already know what you're going to do. You've known since you unzipped that bag in the canyon." He stood up. "Just make sure the choice you make is the one you're actually making. Not the one you think you owe someone. Not the one you think your father would have made. Yours." He picked up his chair and put it back where he'd found it. 800. Don't be late. He walked out and left her alone with the radio nets and the frequency logs and the dark outside the window that was just beginning barely to consider becoming dawn. She opened the canvas bag, not to take anything out, just to look. The M110 was packed exactly as it had been when she put it away at the relay position. Cleaned, secured, every component in its designated position. The stock worn smooth in the places where her father's hands and then her hands had worn it. Years of contact leaving marks that were invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She looked at the wear patterns and she traced them with one finger, and she thought about continuity, about what passes from one person to another, not through instruction, but through contact, through time, through the 10,000 small moments of a girl learning to be still while her father showed her that the world had angles and that angles could be understood. She closed the bag. She picked up her pen and opened her legal pad to the page she'd been writing on the evening before. She read what she'd written. Then she wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page, just a single sentence, and closed the pad. She stayed at the workstation until 0600 doing actual communications work, clearing the overnight queue and preparing the morning frequency update with the focused efficiency that Dana Polk had assessed on her first day and filed away as potentially useful. The work was clean and complete and required nothing from her that she wasn't giving freely. She liked that about communications. It was honest. What it needed, it asked for. What you gave, it used. At 0615, Mitchell found her. He came into the comm shack with 2 cups of coffee, handed her one without asking whether she wanted it, and sat on the edge of a workstation. "Sarah brief you on the 0800, he asked. Duke did. Good. He drank his coffee. "I want to say something before that meeting." She looked at him. "Whatever they offer you in there, you have the right to say no." He held her gaze. "You have the right to finish this deployment as a communications specialist and go home and live whatever life you decide to live. Nobody in that room can order you into a role you haven't chosen." A pause. "I want to make sure you know that, because sometimes in rooms like that, with the people who will be in that room, it can feel like the decision has already been made for you. It hasn't." She looked at him carefully. "Are you telling me to be careful?" "I'm telling you that you have options. Real ones. Yesterday changed what those options are. It didn't eliminate your right to choose between them." She thought about what he was actually saying underneath what he was saying, the kind of man he was, West Point, in 2 tours, and the particular brand of integrity that comes from a person who believes that authority is something you earn and exercise carefully or not at all. "Thank you, sir," she said, and meant it fully. He nodded, finished his coffee. "Also," he said, standing, "Dana Polk asked me to tell you the morning frequency update was the cleanest she's seen in 6 weeks. Her words, not mine." A pause. "She also said, and I'm quoting directly here, that you're wasted on antennas." Also her words. Kira almost smiled. "Tell her I said thank you." He left. She drank her coffee and watched the sun come up through the narrow comm shack window and felt the day assemble itself around her with the particular clarity of a morning after something large has permanently altered the landscape. The 0800 meeting was in a room she'd never been, in a secure conference space she hadn't known existed inside the building she'd walked past every day since arriving. Sarah was there, and Hargrove and two other people who were introduced by first names, only a man named Philip and a woman named Dr. Reyes, no relation to the corpsman, who had the specific kind of academic precision in her speech patterns that meant she studied human performance under conditions most people never encounter. They talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. She wasn't going to detail what was said, not because she'd been told not to, though she had been, but because some conversations exist in a register that belongs only to the people who were in the room for them, and reducing them to summary loses the thing that made them matter. What she would carry out of that room was the knowledge that what she was being offered was real and specific, and would require her to become officially and completely the thing she'd been her entire life without being allowed to name it, and that the choice was genuinely hers. Mitchell had been right about that. She asked 3 questions. They answered all 3 directly, which told her the most important thing she needed to know about the people she'd be working with. Then she said yes. Philip shook her hand. Dr. Reyes made a note. Sarah looked at her with a kind of professional satisfaction. That was the closest thing to warmth that intelligence people allow themselves in official settings. Hargrove didn't shake her hand. He looked at her across the table and said, "You understand that this conversation didn't happen." "Understood, sir. And that your service record as of today reflects only what it reflected yesterday pending the formal review process." "Understood. And that the people on your convoy who know what happened in that canyon are operating under a discretion order as of 1900 last night." She absorbed that. "All of them, all of them?" A pause. "They were asked, not ordered. Every single one of them agreed without hesitation." He held her gaze. "That tells you something about the impression you made." She walked out of that room at 10:17 and stood in the corridor and breathed. In for 4, hold, 4 out. The method her father had given her, the architecture of calm built into her before she was old enough to question it so deep that it had survived 7 years of deliberate disuse and come back online in a canyon under fire like it had never been interrupted. She would not be a communications specialist much longer. She would be something else. Something that didn't have a public name and wouldn't for a long time. Something that required exactly the combination of things she was: the stillness, the patience, the ability to read a room and a ridgeline with equal precision, the gift for being present in a space without pressing against its edges, the 7 years of living as someone other people looked past. The invisibility she'd worn like armor was about to become her most essential professional asset. She found Kane at 10:45 near the vehicle bay. He was doing what Kane was always doing when he wasn't actively required elsewhere working, running through gear, checking equipment, occupying himself with the physical tasks that kept him from having to be idle. He heard her coming and looked up. "How'd the meeting go?" he asked. "Fine." He studied her. "You said yes to something. I can't discuss it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Burke's going to be furious when he finds out he can't be your spotter." She looked at him. "He'll find out when there's something to find out." "Right." Kane set down the equipment he was checking and looked at her directly. "I want to say something I should have said in the briefing room 2 days ago." "Kane?" "No, let me say it." He held up a hand, not aggressive, asking, "You spotted a compromised ridgeline from a comms shack window. You mapped 4 ambush positions from satellite imagery without being asked. You requested a halt on the radio when everyone else was still running normal mission protocols. And I talked over it. All of it." He held her gaze. "That won't happen again. Not from me and not from anyone in my team if I can prevent it." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had said, "Get her out of my convoy" in a briefing room 36 hours ago, with the casual certainty of someone who has never had to seriously interrogate his assumptions. At the man who had sat with her in a corridor yesterday and told her about his father and 8 months of silence. At the man who was standing here now doing the hardest thing, not apologizing, which is easy, but recalibrating, which costs something real. "What changed?" she asked, not to challenge him, genuinely wanting to know. He thought about it, actually thought about it, which she respected. "I've been in this work long enough that I've started to mistake experience for complete knowledge. Like I've seen enough that I know in advance what's worth paying attention to." A pause. That's a dangerous place to get to. I know that. I just forgot it. He held her gaze. You reminded me. She nodded. We're good, Kane, she said again, and meant it again differently this time, more completely. He picked his equipment back up. Then he said without looking at her, your father's name is on a memorial at Bragg. I've walked past it. I never stopped. A pause. I'll stop next time. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She found Burke in the medical bay at 11:30. He was 2 days from being cleared to travel, his shoulder healing on the aggressive end of the projected timeline, because Burke was the kind of person whose body responded to injury the way his mind responded to obstacles, by treating them as problems to be solved through determination. He was reading when she came in, actual reading a worn paperback whose spine had been broken and repaired with electrical tape. He looked up and set the book down immediately. I heard you had a meeting this morning, he said. News travels fast. On this base, news travels at the speed of boredom, which is faster than light. He studied her. You said yes. You don't know what was offered. No, but I know you said yes to it. It's in how you're standing. He tilted his head. I was serious about the spotter offer. I know you were, but that's not what's happening. She looked at him steadily. Not exactly, no. He was quiet for a moment, processing. She watched him work through the shape of it without the content and arrive somewhere close to the truth through pure inference, the way good operators do. He'd been doing this long enough to recognize the outline of a certain kind of transition, even when the details were classified. Okay, he said, finally, just that. Okay. I said what I said yesterday about debts. That stands regardless of what you do next. He picked up his book again. Go be whatever you're going to be, Ashford. Just be good at it. I intend to, she said. She walked out of the medical bay and across the courtyard in the full midday heat and thought about all the people on this base who had seen her in the last 48 hours and would now carry a version of her that was different from the one they'd had before. The young private who'd looked at her with open awe. The female specialist who'd said it matters. Dana Polk, who'd called her wasted on antennas. Garza in the comm shack. Torres in his QRF vehicle shaking his head at the numbers. Every person who'd watched her walk through the courtyard and recalibrated their picture of what a person can be when the exterior doesn't match the interior. She thought about the female specialist's words one more time. People who get looked past. It matters. It mattered because it was true, and it was true not just for her, but for every person who had ever been handed a role that was smaller than their capability and told to stay inside it. Every person who had looked at a ridgeline through a comm shack window and kept their mouth closed because the room wouldn't have listened. Every person who had packed something essential in a canvas bag and carried it through years of not being allowed to use it, waiting for the moment when not using it would cost more than anything else. She stopped in the middle of the courtyard. She pulled out her legal pad, found the page, read the sentence she'd written at the bottom in the pre-dawn quiet of the comm shack. She'd written it as a private thing, a note to herself, the kind of thing her father had written in his notebooks, and her mother still had in a box in Fayetteville. It said the gift was never the rifle. The gift was knowing when it was time. She closed the pad. She looked up at the northern ridgeline. Clear. Still. Patient. The same ridgeline she'd looked at it through the comm shack window on her first day, marking it, reading it, knowing something about it that she hadn't been ready to say out loud. The same rock and scrub and distance that had looked wrong to her before it looked wrong to anyone else. She stood there for a full minute, just looking, just being still in the particular way that her father had taught her, and that 7 years had not taken, and that a canyon ambush had not shaken, and that whatever came next would not change. The stillness was hers. It had always been hers. It was the first thing Marcus Ashford had given her, and the last thing that could be taken away. She let out a slow breath. Then she slung the canvas bag over her shoulder, tucked the legal pad under her arm, and walked toward whatever came next with her head down and her eyes up exactly the way she'd been taught, seeing everything ready for anything invisible to no one anymore. Kira Ashford, daughter of Marcus, keeper of a broken promise and an unbroken gift, had finally stopped walking past herself, and that from this day forward was the most dangerous thing she would ever do.